Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charles Powell, and I'm the director of the Elcano Royal Institute here in Madrid, Spain. And I'd like to welcome you all to this roundtable on the Ukraine war and the future of NATO's strategic concept. So for the next hour or so, we're going to be looking at the way in which the war in Ukraine has affected or may still affect the drafting of NATO's strategic concept, which, as you all know, will be approved and launched publicly in Madrid during the NATO summit in June. And to discuss these matters, we have three outstanding panelists, whom I will introduce very briefly. First of all, we have Benedict Alberti, who is head of policy planning at the Office of the Secretary General of NATO. Good afternoon, Benedetta. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
We also have with us Dan Hamilton, who is a dear friend and has very kindly agreed to take part in today's session, as he has on many other occasions in the past. And Dan is Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Brookings Institution and also Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. Good afternoon, good morning to you, Dan.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Charles.
And finally, hello. Finally, we have, last but by no means least, we have Simón, who is our senior analyst here at Elcano and also director of our office in Brussels. Good afternoon, Luis.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes, Charles.
So it's a great pleasure to have all of you with us. And those of you who are following us on live streaming, let me just inform you that you can send your questions to the following address, events@rielcano, RIElcano.org. Let me repeat that, events@rielcano.org. Okay, so without further ado then, let's jump into this fascinating topic. And of course, it couldn't be more timely. I remember thinking about the NATO strategic concept back in November, taking part in several seminars at the time. And I think there was a distinct lack of enthusiasm, or at least a lack of passion concerning the strategic concept then. People were worried about how the text would deal with what at the time seemed the biggest challenge to NATO, namely the rise of China, of an increasingly irredentist and difficult Chinese partner. And of course, events in Ukraine have overtaken all of that. And I suppose if there is a silver lining in this horrible, very dark cloud, which is the Ukraine war, then that silver lining is that it has given NATO a new sense of purpose. It has very clearly shown that NATO was by no means brain dead, as a well-known French politician once claimed. And in a sense, I suppose, it's now back to basics. We no longer need to explain to our citizens why we need NATO, why our countries are so firmly committed to NATO. And just before we went on the air, I was discussing with Benedetta a recent poll which Elcano conducted a couple of weeks before the Russian invasion, according to which 80% of Spaniards now support Spanish membership of NATO, which is the highest level ever registered, I think, in an opinion poll. And secondly, and almost equally importantly, 34% of Spaniards identified Russia as the biggest threat to Spanish national security. Again, totally unprecedented and impossible to predict only a couple of weeks before that. Morocco and the hardest terrorist threat were also mentioned in that poll. But the point I want to stress is that in terms of threat perception, this war has already dramatically changed how Spaniards see the European security architecture, how Spaniards perceive their membership of NATO. And of course, this means, therefore, that the Madrid summit in June will be seen by public opinion in a very different and I think much more positive light. So without further ado, let me hand over to Benedetta, who is we've asked her to give us a short account, a brief account of her perception of NATO's response to the war in Ukraine so far. And perhaps, Benedetta, your views on how the war may affect the ongoing process that will eventually lead to the adoption of this new strategic concept in Madrid. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Charles, and it's great to be here with this very esteemed panel. So I will kick it off with some very short remarks, and I'll start by attempting. I think that's the best I can do to answer your really important question, which is how is the current situation and how is Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine affecting our thinking as an alliance, and how is it going to reshape, if that's the word, the NATO strategy? Because that's essentially that's what our strategic concept needs to be. It is the expression of the alliance grand strategy, and of course, as you know, the last one was written in 2010, so the word has changed tremendously since then. And I would argue that even before February 24th, and even before Russia's beginning of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, the word was already a dramatically different, more unstable and more unpredictable place. But of course, this is a watershed in European security, so it needs to be accounted for when it comes to the strategic concept. I do not know, and that's, I think, a very important thing to say. There is much I do not know, and I think there is much we do not know about the outcome of this brutal and unprovoked and unjustified war. We don't know how it's going to end. We don't know what the Euro-Atlantic security order will look like in the day after, quote unquote. We do not know if talking about a day after is the right way to look at it as well. So there's a lot that we cannot really predict or anticipate. And I think that's important to recognize, to be a little bit humble from that perspective. But my personal opinion is that there are, however, some trends, some broader trends that we can extrapolate from this horrible crisis, and that we can use to shape our next strategy. And I think a good starting point here for those who are listening to this conversation is to go back to the 2010 concept and to take a look at how we as an alliance saw the world. And it was a fairly rosy description of reality. He said the Euro-Atlantic area is at peace. The risk of conventional war is low. We are going to continue to work towards building a true strategic partnership with Russia. And fundamentally, the entire concept is underpinned by an idea that Europe, the Euro-Atlantic space, is a space of predictability, of stability, of shared norms, of shared agreements. In other words, it's an area of cooperation and peace. Unfortunately, even if we do not know how this crisis will end, I think we can already say a few things about that description. And we can say that description will not be accurate for the foreseeable future. I think if we look at Europe and North America and we look at how we should approach our future, we could start by saying, well, the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace. The concept of Europe whole, free, and at peace, unfortunately, it's not something that seems readily available in the current situation. This is the gravest security crisis since the end of the Second World War. No matter what, there will be instability in the short to mid-term. We should think about how do we prepare for a war that is more unpredictable, that is more unstable, where the risk of conflict is something we need to be able to manage, and where we have to actively work to reduce risks and prevent escalation. These are all issues that I think we can put on the table already today, and that will be relevant for our future no matter what. And then, of course, even before the 24th of February, I think we could have already said that our relationship with Russia was not one that was working towards a strategic partnerships. Since 2014, Russia had been deliberately engaged in a pattern of destabilizing behavior, threatening its neighborhood, conducting provocative activities near NATO's borders, trying to undermine our society through hybrid or cyber or other types of hybrid means. In other words, there was already a very worrisome trend at play. Of course, now we see the escalation of this trend, but I think pretty sobering assessment of our relationship with our neighbor are definitely overdue given the current situation. And then, of course, in 2010, we didn't really look at the broader global security environment. That concept did not mention China, did not mention the rise of China, the role of China. And today, of course, we need to account for how China's rise and its impact on the global stage affects Euro-Atlantic security. So these are some issues that I think, regardless of how this conflict concludes, and I hesitate to use the word, we would need a strategy that tackles the war that is more unpredictable, complex, and fundamentally competitive than the one in 2010. Are there things that we are looking at? There are also, if I look at the current allied response to this unprovoked war of aggression, I can see there are some elements that I think are useful to also to draw out and to also reflect in our next strategy. One is that in the middle of this systemic shifts and grave crisis, the need, and you mentioned this in your introduction, the need for transatlantic unity is clearer and greater than it has been for generations. And one of the lessons that I hope we can learn and internalize from the past few weeks is that we can and we do act at the speed of relevance, and we can act together as a transatlantic community. And when we do so, we are much more effective and united. And of course, Europe and North America have stood together in the light of this dramatic crisis by imposing unprecedented sanctions on Russia, by calling out on the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw all troops and stop this unprovoked war of aggressions that they are responsible for. So we have seen transatlantic unity at come together, and we have seen, and I think that the next strategy will have to reiterate that this is the only way that we can tackle the systemic challenges that are on our agenda. The other point that I will make, and then I'll stop because I think we want to have plenty of time for Q&A. But the second point is that we have seen through this crisis how transatlantic unity matters. We have also seen through this crisis how our ability to defend and deter matters, and that's something perhaps obvious, but it hasn't always been obvious. In 2010, when we looked at what are the principal threats and challenges to our security, and what are the most likely examples that will require us to deploy force, well, we thought mostly about out-of-area crisis management operations. And of course, today is a different world since 2014. And I have to say, it's very important to say that we haven't shifted back to collective defense on the 24th of February 2022. We have started shifting back in 2014, which is why when Russia began its invasion, a new invasion of Ukraine, allies were able to activate defense plans, deploy troops, place over 40,000 troops under direct NATO command, create new battle groups that they reinforce our deterrence and defense throughout our eastern flank. All this, we were able to do this really fast because we have been reinforcing our defense and deterrence posture for many years now. And I think this dramatic crisis reinforces the importance of continuing to strengthen our deterrence and defense, and to really go back, as you say, to basic in terms of the ability to do territorial defense and collective defense of Europe. Lastly, and then I'll stop because I think it would be remiss if I didn't mention this other point, as we are as we are focusing, rightly so, our minds and our forces and our attention where it should be now at the moment, we are not just going back to the past. We're not forgetting that we live in a very complex world, that many of the threats and challenges we face are not territorial based. Terrorism, cyber threats, hybrid threats from space. In other words, we need to retain a global approach, and we also need to retain the ability to engage with our partners, the ability to counter terrorism, the ability to do cooperative security. So this is an alliance that remains that remains able to focus on different threats, different theaters, different domains. The point is, if it is a threat to our allies, we need to be able to respond. And I very much think this would be a key point in writing our new strategy. I'll stop here for the sake of time, but happy to return to all of these points later.
Thank you very much, Benedetta. And perhaps something that I will ask you about later is your take on the extraordinary manner in which the NATO's response has adapted as the war progressed. At the beginning, we were talking about sending helmets and bulletproof vests, and now we're discussing sending sophisticated weapon systems. So I think that's something that a lot of our viewers, of which there are, by the way, about 100 right now, thank you very much for joining us, will be curious about. Dan, over to you. I was hoping that you might briefly summarize the recent NATO task force report that you have been involved in producing, and perhaps specifically say a little about how the war may affect the ongoing debate, which was already quite lively before the war, of course, concerning NATO's three core tasks, namely collective defense, out-of-area crisis management, and cooperative security. But please feel free, of course, to chip in as far as the NATO strategic concept itself is concerned, and where you think that this will now be going in light of the Ukraine war. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. It's great to see you again and be with my friends at Elcano to follow Benedetta. So for those who are interested in more detail, let me just say right up front, if you go to transatlantic.org, you'll find a report that's by a NATO task force in which Luis has participated, which has much more detail. But let me, in the space of time here, just do some highlights of what we are recommending that we do believe need to be enshrined in this new strategic concept, but are also just important to NATO's long-term future. And I start with the same setting that Benedetta ended with, which really the Atlantic Alliance faces the most complex strategic environment in its history. We've really never faced the complexity of all these challenges all at once, the simultaneity of them. And I think if we look forward, we're likely to face a persistent confrontation with Russia, broader great power competition, including multidimensional challenges from China, and a whole host of sort of what I would call disruptive threats to our societies, to the critical functions of our societies. We're talking about, different kinds of threats. Climate change, pandemic, terrorism, technology is upending how we even interact with each other. There's just a whole, and all of those are susceptible to disruption, either by state actors, Mother Nature, groups, even individuals. And that's a very different notion of security, but absolutely essential. And it interacts with the Russia-China dynamic also in important ways. So our proposal is to think about what we call 1+4. The one is allied unity and cohesion. It's absolutely fundamental to everything else NATO would want to do. And that in Madrid, it's very important that NATO affirm that it is an alliance of democracies. Democracy, the value-based foundation of the alliance, is really what distinguishes NATO from any other kind of collection that you would see. And affirming that, not only time of external threat, but frankly, we've had many internal challenges and disruptions to our own democracies that have caused some to question that. So we think the one is cohesion, it's foundational. But the four are the three core tasks you mentioned, Charles, and then we would suggest adding one, realizing that not everyone necessarily agrees with that. Collective defense is clearly now the primary core task of the alliance. It's the only task, in fact, mentioned in the North Atlantic Treaty. And alliance leaders today are going around in public saying, we will, quote, defend every inch of NATO territory. Well, what would that mean? That means we have to move from the current collective defense posture, which is small groups of forces on the eastern borders that would clearly be overrun in the event of an invasion, and then reinforced from the rear, including the United States, and then sort of having to reoccupy territory. That's the current NATO approach. If you look at the destruction of Ukrainian cities and the horrific atrocities that are being committed against civilian populations, it becomes clear that's not a credible strategy for NATO. So we have to move away from tripwire defense and deterrence by sort of reinforcement to one of robust forward defense and deterrence by denial. That is, not even touching that territory. That's a very different military posture and a very different political posture than what we have now. It also means thinking about all the domains in which we have to contest Russia, but also think of pressures that are coming from NATO's south and southeast. And that's not just, land, it's outer space, it's cyberspace, it is air, it is maritime, and how the alliance has to address all of those all at once across all those domains is really going to be the collective defense challenge for the alliance. Crisis management, we recommend what we call a southern approach of what we call comprehensive support, in which Europe takes the lead, anticipating and planning for contingencies related to armed conflicts, displacement, persistent terrorist threats, security challenges come from an array of instabilities all along the alliance's southern periphery. Cooperative security is the third core task. Here, of course, we're challenged because cooperative security has been mentioned and interpreted in the past as NATO plus its partners. NATO actually has more partners than it does members. But partners, especially in Europe now, are under some threat. In fact, a few of them have Russian troops on their territory. So what do we do there? We are recommending what we call a secure neighborhood initiative for Europe non-NATO partners that would do two things. NATO, as NATO, would commit itself to help those countries defend themselves against Russian aggression. And secondly, would help them become more resilient to these disruptive threats that we see to their societies. Both pieces of that are quite critical. And Ukraine, of course, would be a major partner in that, but I don't think we should be limited as Ukraine. Georgia is also under threat. The tiny country of Moldova, poorest country in Europe, but at a critical spot for Europe if you think about how things might escalate. It's really quite critical that we come up with an approach that thinks about this region going forward. We should strengthen also other partnerships and expand the notion of cooperative security to think about the global commons and challenges that rise from, as I said before, climate change, economic energy interdependencies, technological advances. We have to expand the notion of cooperative security to a broad range of non-traditional threats. So those are the three core tasks. Each of them, I think, stand up still, but need to be updated. But what we propose is a fourth core task that we call comprehensive resilience. If you think about these disruptive challenges today to our societies, you see resilience is quite foundational to all the other core tasks, but it has to address a broader spectrum of challenges that the other tasks simply don't cover. And so far, NATO recognizes the importance of resilience, but it has adopted sort of, in my view, a somewhat static country-by-country resilience metrics that about critical infrastructures. Every country has to show how resilient they are. If you think of Europe today, in my view, it doesn't seem you can be resilient on your own. Resilience starts at home, but no nation's home alone anymore. And the interconnections between our society means it doesn't really matter how resilient you are if your neighbor isn't. So shared resilience becomes really quite foundational. That the metrics we have is how together we are resilient, not how we are resilient all on our own. And Ukraine has illustrated one last piece of the resilience challenge, which is how can we project resilience forward and adopt a concept of forward resilience so that weak and vulnerable neighbors outside of our territory also are resilient to these disruptions, because if they're not, all of those negative things flow back into our alliance territory. It's in our own self-interest to project that resilience forward. So that's the 1+4. And let me just conclude by just mentioning one other important issue, which is, as we think about this, it's important to understand what's happening. European countries are all saying we will invest more in our defense now. We are changing. The changes in Europe at the moment are quite surprising and stunning. But much of it is about, so far, about spending money. And it's not harnessed yet to any strategic goal in particular. If you think about the German debate, they're mainly opening up their checkbook, and it's unclear what they're going to spend that money on. So we suggest that we have to think much harder about the strategic goals of this reorientation. And that means also thinking about the US-European relationship. The United States is also Indo-Pacific power, and we are addressing issues important to Europe in that part of the world. And what we see is the strategic connections between the North Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific are coming together. And if a conflict should break out with China and Asia and Russia and Europe at the same time, the US may not be able to adequately reinforce Europe. European allies need to understand that, and they need to be able to pick up the slack. So what we propose is defining not strategic autonomy, which has been the debate, but what the Finns, the Dutch, and others call strategic responsibility, which means by 2030, European allies should be able to provide half of the forces and the enablers that are required for deterrence and collective defense against Russian aggression. Half of that. Right now, the United States provides more than half of that. And many Americans wonder how that can possibly be. So equal responsibility on that front. And then second, with these kinds of increased capabilities, Europe should be the first responder to crises in and around its southern periphery, able to conduct those crisis management operations and take the lead without relying, as our European colleagues still do, on all these important US enablers. It's the US Air Force that sometimes get Europeans to the south. It's intelligence and logistics that make that work, all provided by the United States. That doesn't seem to be in anybody's interest. So with those two goals in mind, we need to rebalance our relationship even as we strengthen it, which would assure that the United States remains engaged in Europe, but it also means the United States will be able to take care of these other challenges that are still affecting European security, but are half a world away. There is a whole dimension of this related to the Indo-Pacific and China, but I know Luis will probably want to comment on that, so I'll just leave that now, but to say we do talk about it in our report. Thank you.
Excellent, Dan. Well, thank you for covering so much ground, and I, of course, encourage our viewers to read that very interesting report, and of course it'll be interesting to see how much of that eventually makes its way into the new strategic concept. I'm sure Benedetta is fully aware of your thoughts and the very interesting conclusions you've come to. So let me turn to Luis now, and Dan has already mentioned two things, Luis, that particularly interest you. One is precisely this relationship between what's happening in Ukraine and the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region. You have argued very forcefully, I think, in a piece that I think originally appeared with CSIS and has also been published by Elcano. You argued that contrary to what a lot of European commentators seem to believe, there is in fact a very direct relationship between what's happening in Ukraine and our ability, and the US's ability in particular, to face up to the challenges posed by China's increasingly belligerent and assertive presence in that region. And Dan has also mentioned the second point that I would like you to address, namely the southern neighborhood. I think there is some concern in Spain that the events in Ukraine will inevitably lead NATO to shift most of its attention towards the eastern neighborhood, which is perfectly understandable. And I suppose the Spanish government is a little bit concerned that the war has stolen its thunder, so to speak, and that there really won't be too much appetite for a more proactive NATO involvement in that southern neighborhood. And this, of course, will remain a priority for Spain for obvious geographical and geopolitical reasons. So if you could discuss both of those things, and perhaps, I don't know whether you want to venture as to whether, as to how these two dimensions might eventually be reflected in the strategic concept, that would also be useful. Thank you, Reese.
Thanks, Charles. I think the last question is perhaps more for Benedetta, but let me try and touch on both. Although, as you were saying, Benedetta and Dan have indeed covered a lot of ground already. Obviously, the war in Ukraine has put Russia once again at the center of the transatlantic agenda, and we could, of course, say that the annexation of Crimea back in 2014 had already pushed NATO to reprioritize the deterrence in Europe's eastern flank. But the alliance has made an effort in recent years to keep a broader perspective by taking stock of such challenges as the strategic implications of China's rise, and Benedetta touched on that, and so did you, the ongoing relevance of the South, but even also the so-called climate security nexus, right? And other things. And I understand that many of these things are related, they speak to each other. But of course, as you were saying, as we move closer to the Madrid summit and strategic concept, we need to talk about to what extent there is a risk that this push to think beyond the Euro-Atlantic and beyond the military domain loses steam, particularly at a time when NATO's core business, which is deterrence in Europe, is on the spotlight, right, and is under threat. So let me just perhaps zoom in briefly on the China / Indo-Pacific file, because there's been a lot of discussion about how this connects with the war in Ukraine, as you were saying, and there's a lively debate about whether, or perhaps rather to what extent, China is abetting Russia's assault on the European security architecture, and this will obviously have an impact on NATO's debate on China, because all of a sudden this idea that the US was promoting, that China's rise poses a threat or a challenge to Euro-Atlantic security, is becoming more tangible, right? This is an idea that even some NATO allies were skeptical about half a year ago, but now it's a reality, because, and it is a reality even if China continues to strive to convey a nuanced position and insists it is not helping Russia circumvent Western sanctions. But the fact of the matter is that it is indirectly, at least, assisting an assault on the European security architecture. But beyond that point, and you were touching on this, Charles, I think that the war in Ukraine and the need to deter further Russian aggression in Eastern Europe has triggered a debate, and Dan was alluding to this, in the United States about Washington's ability to prioritize strategic competition with China in Asia. Some people have been arguing that the US should avoid getting bogged down in Europe because that could incentivize Beijing to engage in opportunistic aggression in Asia. And we've seen former Assistant Secretary of Defense Brice Colby make that argument publicly and prominently. But I would say most experts are arguing that a hot war in Europe and the real prospect of further military aggression is actually compelling the United States to strengthen its posture in Europe. And it will continue to do that in the foreseeable future. That, of course, doesn't mean that Washington should take its eyes off China, and Dan explained that very clearly. Rather, it means that it should perhaps prepare to deter and win two wars on two fronts simultaneously. There's the whole two-front war debate, and which may indeed require adjustments. And that connects with the burden sharing discussion and the need for Europeans to do more that Dan was mentioning. Of course, a Russian failure in Ukraine could change US calculations over the medium term, and conceivably, and some people have been making that argument, even lay the ground for a proper US strategic rebalance to Asia. But this is just speculation for now. And as Dan has said before, win, lose, or draw, chances are that the demand signal for US attention to Europe will go up, at least in the short term. And as for the medium term, we really don't know. But I would make a broader point, and you were already hinting at that. My sense is that as long as the US and its allies face two great power competitors simultaneously in two different regions, distant regions, and as long as the deterrence architecture in Europe and East Asia hinges largely on US power, and as long as these two regions continue to exercise a significant pressure on US defense resources, the security of both regions will remain very much intertwined, even if indirectly, but it will remain very much intertwined. And I think this sort of compels us all, not just the United States, but also US allies in both regions, to think about deterrence and alliances in Europe and Asia from an inter-theater perspective. And perhaps we can think about the policy implications of all that later. But just very, very briefly to touch on the South, which is the other point you raised, Charles. Of course, the war in Ukraine and the need to set priorities will affect the debate about NATO's role in the Southern neighborhood, meaning essentially North Africa and the Middle East, but also increasingly the Sahel, right, which is particularly of interest to the Spanish government, but also others. And I would perhaps highlight two issues related to priorities. The first has to do with geostrategic priorities and the growing preeminence of the Eastern flank in NATO debates. And the second has to do with a de facto prioritization of collective defense over crisis management or collective security, which have been the preferred modes of action for NATO in the South, by the way. And that has partly to do with priorities and the decision to prioritize deterrence, but it also has to do with intervention fatigue, as illustrated by the lessons from Afghanistan and a transition towards a more indirect approach to projecting stability. So what would be the implications of all that? Well, first, I think we're likely to see more emphasis on this idea of the South as a theater in strategic competition with Russia, but also with China. We're also likely to see more emphasis on this notion that NATO should follow a 360-degree approach to deterrence, even if the deterrence-related challenges in the East are different from those in the South. And I think another implication relates to what I would call the crisis of crisis management and the ongoing transition towards a more indirect approach to projecting stability. And I think that connects quite nicely with a concept that Dan has been talking about, which is that of forward resilience or shared resilience, which is basically about strengthening the resilience of NATO's partners so that they can better resist pressures from adversaries or competitors, but also from other challenges like terrorism or organized crime or even climate severity, right? And I think the background assumption here, I would say, is that in this new era of strategic competition, the South better be aligned with the Euro-Atlantic community. And that requires a long-term investment in the region. And that sort of forward resilience strategy, if you will, I think has to go beyond NATO and put partnerships front and center, both with regional actors, but also with other relevant actors such as the EU, given that a proper forward resilience strategy has to transcend the security domain. So I think in a way, forward resilience, to go back to the discussion on the tasks that Benedetta put on the table and then Dan also unpacked, I think that forward resilience in a way sort of combines crisis management and cooperative security in the sense that it appeals to a more indirect approach to projecting stability, for instance, through partner capacity building rather than direct NATO intervention. So I think that this concept of forward resilience that Dan has been promoting among others has a lot of potential in terms of framing NATO's vision for the southern neighborhood, but also NATO's vision towards partnerships more generally, and also has, I think, potential for the Indo-Pacific. And I would perhaps, just before wrapping up, underscore two dimensions here. First, there's the whole piece about strengthening the resilience of actual NATO partners in North Africa and the Middle East, but also there's the dimension of working with partners to strengthen the resilience of non-partners elsewhere in the South in areas of common interest, such as the Sahel, for instance, but also the Gulf of Guinea or the Horn of Africa. I think I'll stop it there and looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Reese, for that very comprehensive overview. We have questions coming in, so let me remind our viewers that they can send them in to the following address, events@rielcano.org. And I have a couple of questions for Benedetta. One of them inevitably is retrospective to some extent. Of course, there's been a lot of media discussion as to, and not just media discussion, sadly, as to whether NATO enlarged too far too soon. Ivo Daldo, the former US ambassador to NATO, recently wrote a nicely provocative piece in which, as you will know, he argued that NATO didn't enlarge far enough, and that, of course, if Ukraine had in fact been offered membership or had been able to join, it was offered membership at the Bucharest summit, of course, had Ukraine already joined NATO, then we would be in a very different place today. So my first question, Benedetta, is, I mean, this is to some extent an academic and not a very practical discussion right now, but I'd like your take on that. And secondly, and perhaps with a greater sense of urgency here, as I mentioned in my very brief introduction, we've moved quite quickly from being rather reluctant to commit military assistance to a situation in which we are already sending vital military assistance, and we may have to send much more in weeks and months to come. And the question I'm receiving here is, obviously, we're not going to impose a no-fly zone. Clearly, we're not going to send troops. Both of those would, of course, lead us to a direct military confrontation with Russia. But is there anything else that we can do on the military front? Is there anything that NATO can do, or that NATO can encourage the allies to do that it hasn't done already? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to be quite brief, but of course you put on the table really important questions that would require long answers, but I'll try to be as succinct as possible. Let me start with your second and third question, which I can summarize as what is the Allied response in terms of supporting Ukraine and supporting the right to self-defense. I think that's the right way to talk about it, which is of course enshrined in the UN Charter, and it's of course one of their basic rights as a country under invasion. So first of all, I mentioned in my initial remarks that how since the beginning of Putin's war of aggression, allies have stood together in terms of using the economic levers, so of course sanctions, and that's I mention it again because it's also a good example of how North America and Europe, NATO and the European Union can bring together their respective competencies, respecting added value, coordinate and impose real costs on the Russian Federation. And of course, we can talk about whether those sanctions are going far enough or fast enough, but that's a separate conversation, which I'm happy to have. But let's start with that, with a set of tools of statecraft that have been employed. And then, of course, there is the essential, I would say, support to Ukraine's right of self-defense. And that is something that is done, and I want to be quite clear here, on a bilateral basis by NATO allies. So the NATO allies, the 30 NATO allies, are supporting Ukraine's right of self-defense through a variety of different means. And as you rightly pointed out, support for their defense, including with lethal aid, has been increasing over the past weeks. This is, of course, something that is incredibly important to ensure that this war of aggression ends and to ensure that Putin's horrific actions are stopped. But that is done mostly on a bilateral basis in terms of providing lethal equipment. NATO as an organization has, of course, been supporting Ukraine for many years through training, capacity building. Currently, it is involved in coordination on non-lethal humanitarian assistance. It's also been stepping up cybersecurity assistance and looking at how to support Ukraine's right of self-defense. But NATO is not actively providing weapons. Allies are. What else? What more? This is an important question because just today we just finished a foreign ministerial meeting of our foreign ministers where they were discussing exactly that question. What more can we do to keep up the support to Ukraine, but also what more can we do to step up support to other partners that are vulnerable to aggression in our neighborhood to exactly help strengthen their resilience and to shore up their ability so that they can defend themselves. And of course, we're thinking Georgia, we're thinking Bosnia and Herzegovina. So there has exactly been the discussion happening just this afternoon. And there are concrete measures that are being adopted to step up assistance. And I believe that that's incredibly important. Then your first question very quickly. Oh dear, that is a very long standing debate. I will be as quick as I can and say in the current I think we need to be very, very careful when we frame this conflict to be very clear about whose responsibility it is, but we also have to be very clear about what this conflict is about and what it is not. And although I do think there is merit in absolutely having an open intellectual discussions about NATO enlargement, what worked, what didn't, that's absolutely fine. And but I think we shouldn't get confused. Nothing that has been done over the past, nothing justifies a war of aggression. Nothing justifies using force, forcibly changing borders. Nothing justifies indiscriminate attacks against civilians, the war crimes that we're seeing. The type of rhetoric that we hear from the Russian Federation, the revanchist, revisionist rhetoric is something that can simply not be explained away, if not by saying this is an attempt by one country to deny another sovereign country the right to freely choose their own path and their own destiny. And that's substantially, and that's not just a horrible situation for Ukraine. I would say this is an incredibly dangerous situation for the overall European security order and for the rules-based international order. It's about what type of world you want to live in. It's a world, you want to live in a world where might makes right and where small countries do not have a right to territorial integrity, political independence, or to choose their own alliance freely, or do we want to live in a world based on shared principles? So that is not to say that there is not merit in having an intellectual discussion and say how and have that historical conversation about enlargement, which personally I think is an historical success for our alliance. Over decades through enlargement, we were able to bring security to millions of Europeans. We were able to facilitate European integration. Let's not forget the NATO enlargement was a stepping stone to EU membership. I think it's been a hugely stabilizing and successful path for those countries who have chosen independently and through their sovereign right to become members. But I do not think for 1 minute that this particular Russian regime I believe that what is threatening them is a sovereign, democratic, and free Ukraine able to make its own choices. And this is not about NATO enlargement. This is about establishing spheres of control and influence. That's, of course, my entirely personal opinion, but there you go. There you have it.
I think that's a very good point. And of course, I would like to remind our listeners that going back to the color revolution in Ukraine, the Maidan or Euromaidan, that was essentially triggered because Russia stood in the way of an agreement between Ukraine and the European Union. And that had absolutely nothing to do with NATO. And I think this is something we should keep in mind. Dan, you've been writing about and observing the transatlantic relationship for several decades. And you already mentioned one of the most interesting developments that we've seen since the war started, namely Germany's remarkable foreign policy shift, which I think one can describe as a revolution in terms of German foreign policy. And I'd like you to, we have several questions about that coming in. You know, how do you see that affecting some of the policies that you've described in your analysis of the 1+4, particularly if we're thinking about strategic responsibility and a scenario in which by 2030, 50% of the burden for Europe's territorial defense would effectively have to be provided by European actors. You mentioned the magic figure of 100 billion euros. And as you rightly also said, we're basically talking about money. We're not really saying too much about how we're going to spend that money effectively. And of course, as our listeners well know, one of our classic European conundrums is that we actually spend quite a lot, but we don't spend terribly well. And there is perhaps a real danger that this very large amount of money will once again not be spent terribly well. In other words, in a manner which truly helps to defend Europe as a region. What are your thoughts on some of these issues? Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. If you allow me one comment on NATO's open door. You know, NATO opened its door to other democracies before the Cold War ended. And one of those included Spain. And the principle of the open door has been with us for decades. It was not something that was pushed earlier. So, and I recommend to you our article actually today by Bill Clinton in the Atlantic journal on exactly on this, why I enlarged NATO. And I was Madeleine Albright's, director of policy planning, associate director, and this is all we worked on. So anyway, but the current reality is that my point about Germany, it's a remarkable development in Germany. And everyone's pointing to how new all of this is. It's new in the sense of a shift of mindset, but spending more money is not very new in terms of German foreign policy. It's actually the old way of doing things. So that's what I said, checkbook diplomacy has been the traditional way the Germans have sought to get out of their jam sometimes, is just spend more money on things. So that actually reflects an old mentality, not a new one. And that's why my test for Germany will be how much of this really will be channeled to real strategic impact. And what will the other European allies and others think about that? It actually relates a bit to the United States. Sometimes we don't talk about this, but one reason why NATO exists is not only to confront external threats, and this actually goes to the point of enlargement, actually, it's also to manage relations among allies and to provide this transatlantic link in which the United States is a source of reassurance to Europeans, not a source of anxiety. I would argue a number of years ago, we were more a source of anxiety for you all than a source of reassurance. I think now we might be more a source of reassurance, but some of that reassurance has to do with Germany's role, which no one wants to say in polite company. But everyone knows the Germans are there and the Americans are around too. Germany's rise is more palatable, so we say that. Germany's embedded in lots of things that are predictable. We actually reassure the Germans about themselves also. Which again, no one really wants to say, but I will say it. And so how the United States re-engages with Europe as a source of reassurance that the Germans can step up to these strategic goals, I think is actually quite critical. But if you take the point I was making, it means Germany will need to spend money to get its real forces up to speed. They've atrophied, and they'll have to be ready to position forward defense enablers along their eastern borders. And it's striking. You have German forces in the Baltic states. They're welcomed in the Baltic states. This is quite striking. Poland, I'm sure, would do the same if Germany would come to its aid. The Germans are talking about buying what's called the Iron Dome, a defensive shield that would not only be a shield over German territory, but actually project to the east to defend the Baltic states and Poland and probably the Czech Republic, maybe Romania. So that Germany is actually doing this is quite striking. That it does it with everyone else supporting this is also striking. I would just say, but if the US becomes a source of anxiety rather than reassurance, some of that might be a bit more wobbly. And that's why the US role is still actually important. And I said, no one talks about that politely. So I think these are where we need to push on the strategic concept is where are you going to spend this money? On what capabilities? It's really about capabilities going forward and how we can ensure that we have that collective defense and rebalance this relationship. Chancellor Scholz, I think today or yesterday in the Bundestag indicated that they are engaged in discussions with Ukraine about potential security guarantees should there be some settlement. So the idea that Germany would somehow be involved in some of that is also quite striking. I can't frankly imagine what it would entail, but it shows you this real change in their approach. I just don't think the debate is over in Germany because much of the demonstrations you see, much of the political debate is more anti-war than pro-Ukraine. And I think we need to understand in the German political dynamic, there's a big difference there if we should move to a different kind of settlement in Ukraine. Because the challenge of Ukraine is forcing us to think, as Luis reminded us, win, lose, or draw. I only see a space of turbulence, unsettledness, and sporadic violence in Europe's vast eastern spaces, as far as the eye can see, and that's why the strategic concept needs to take all of that into account.
Thank you very much, and thank you for reminding us that Spain joined NATO almost 40 years ago. In May 1982, I've been doing some nerdy archival research recently, and I've uncovered some interesting documents according to which Soviet authorities threatened the Spanish government at the time not to join NATO because they might see a significant increase in terrorist activity of various kinds in Spain. As you may recall, terrorism, domestic terrorism, was a major source of concern and a major source of political instability. So maybe there's nothing new under the sun. We have to start wrapping up, I'm afraid, and there are lots of questions coming in Greece about the South, and you mentioned the Sahel, and so assuming that the strategic concept does adopt some of these very interesting ideas that we've been discussing, for example, concerning the possibility of the notion of comprehensive resilience and forward resilience and helping our partners become more resilient. How would this play out in practice? How do we see this playing out in practice? For example, in a region such as the Sahel, which is, of course, a major concern for Spain.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. Well, I think as I was trying to convey before, that the concept of resilience, well, everywhere. I mean, but in particular in the South, it really goes beyond the military domain, right? Which is a sort of comparative advantage. That's also why I think so. It needs to have an economic component, a development piece, but also a security sector reform, security resilience piece, right? And I think that's where NATO can really add value, but it needs to be as part of a broader effort involving, well, I think the European Union in particular, but also the member states. So it's about really security sector reform or empowerment in the broad sense of the word, beyond the military proper to also other security services, but also has to entail a broader effort politically and economically. That's also why, I mean, NATO probably should not lead, but it's a very important part of the mix, which is really about, helping others help themselves, which can also be conceivably combined with more direct support in ways that NATO has already been doing, like ISR, and Dan touched on that. So I think we're talking about a comprehensive package that is mostly about indirectly supporting those countries and helping them help themselves through concerted action in the political, economic, and security/military domain.
Thank you very much. And of course, helping countries help themselves is also one of the EU's goals in the area. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and we are a very punctual institution, contrary to certain myths about how things operate in Spain. And I'm afraid that's all we have time for. But certainly, there was a lot of interesting questions coming in. So let me thank the audience, for example, raising the interesting question as to whether the strategic compass and the strategic concept will be fully aligned. But given that there is such a massive overlap in membership in these two crucial organizations, I suppose I have to conclude assuming that they will be largely aligned, and that EU-NATO cooperation will improve very significantly in the months and years to come. So let me just thank our speakers this afternoon. Thank you, Benedetta, Dan, and Reese, for those very interesting thoughts. And I hope we can continue to discuss these issues in the next couple of months. And hopefully, in fact, I very much hope we can see you and have you with us in Madrid in late June. I'm sure the Madrid summit will be a very important one in the history of NATO. As Benedetta was pointing out in her opening statement, the 2010 concept was produced in a very, very different environment. And therefore, this concept, I think, really needs to tackle the issues that NATO and the free world are currently facing. So thank you very much, all of you. And I look forward to seeing you again very shortly. Goodbye now. Buenas tardes a todos.